Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Centre for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host for this week. Feel free to comment on this video and podcast and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to enjoy exclusive content and sneak previews of all of our Thought to Action shows, as well as some special productions and prize drawings, please join our Patreon community, patreon.com/thoughttoaction. See what the London Centre has been up to on our website, londoncentre.org. From the day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and the subsequent intelligence finding the former Soviet Union also developed nuclear warhead technology, the world has had to face the looming specter of nuclear conflict. It got worse when other nations developed that same tech, including quite a few with sketchy relations toward each other. Books, movies, television shows were created showing the potential effects of nuclear devastation. The threat remains a reality despite the fall of the Soviets. Thus the question, what does it take to survive a nuclear attack? With me on Thought to Action is retired British intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Tim Wilson, a senior fellow at the London Centre for Policy Research. He has been trained to and has taught others what to do to give oneself the best chance to survive. Available on the Centre's website is Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's guide, How to Survive a Nuclear Attack. So let's talk about this, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. In 2005, I moved to the USA and I moved in with the lady who is now my wife in Manhattan. And with 9/11 still being very recent in memory then, I was concerned at what happened if there was another major terrorist attack on the US. And I looked around and I searched online and I could not find a really decent guide. And having spent a significant portion of my career in the UK military working on nuclear weapons and their effects and abilities, I knew quite a bit about it. Being a believer in prior planning and preparation prevent poor performance, I decided that we really needed to have a plan for what to do if the very worst happened. And it was the worst case I could think of. Part of my planning and preparation is always to think about what if. And it's a very useful thing to do, because if you've made a plan ahead of time, it may not help, but it may well help. It gives you an idea of what to do when you're not in panic mode. And that alone allows you to be calm and react in a sensible fashion. So as I say, I developed this guide based on a lot of experience and knowledge of nuclear events and their effects. And I would encourage anybody that's interested to read it. Basically, there are 5 simple steps. If you follow those 5 simple steps, you effectively double your chances of surviving. The whole principle is based on the fact that Hiroshima and Nagasaki gave us the one real experience there's been of cities being hit with a nuclear weapon. And the figures are somewhat dubious because there wasn't a solid set of data about how many people there were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the bombs were dropped. But we know that in rough terms, in Hiroshima, for example, 40,000 people died in the actual bomb blast. 100,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of burns, irradiation effects and blast effects, and then another 100,000 died over the succeeding years, succumbing to radiation sickness, about which very little was known then and a lot more is known now. So as I say, there's 5 simple steps in my guide. And if you follow those 5 steps, you literally double your chances of surviving.
Before we get to those 5, Tim, the first thing I do want to emphasize is to our viewers and listeners, we're not trying to scare anyone, but we're offering information as to give yourself the best chance to handle what would be a devastating event. As you said, the worst case scenario.
Absolutely. And I would say, Chris is exactly right there. This would be a devastating event, and the chances of it happening are relatively low. It's the worst case scenario, and there's nothing in this guide can guarantee your survival. There's no guarantees involved. There's so many variables involved in what might happen and what would happen. But planning and preparation, make life easier for everybody, and increases your chances of survival. And therefore, it's worth considering. It's worth discussing with your family. It's worth planning for. And it doesn't, the preparations that I cover in the book wouldn't just cover a nuclear event. They'd cover any major disaster, really. And it's the sort of thing to discuss at the breakfast table. For example, disasters never happen conveniently when and where you expect them to. They'll happen while you're on the way to work, or just after you've dropped the kids at school, or while you're at the hospital having a checkup. And it's having made a plan for what if that happens that really helps you to think things through in a sensible way. Because the big one about a nuclear event is that if you've survived the actual initial blast, it's the radiation, which is a silent, invisible killer. Hence the 5 steps. But as I say, also planning through and talking over with people. For example, if you have just dropped the kids at school, are you allowed to go and get them? In the experience of aftermath of 9/11, schools now will keep the kids, regardless of the parents trying to come to get them. And it's a natural, obvious parental instinct to want to go and get your kids and look after them. But if you're going to make yourself a casualty in doing that, you're not going to be helping them. You're actually going to be being very unhelpful, because suddenly they have to look after you as well as themselves. And the teachers, have enough to do with 15, 20, 30 kids. So think it through, make a plan. And one of the things that I cover later on in the pamphlet is to say, talk it through with your family and think about where should you meet after a disaster. That's pretty important. But the big thing is the 5 main steps. And those main steps, just very quickly, are duck and cover. You may remember that cry from the 60s when the Soviet threat was thought to be imminent. Children were taught in schools. I was taught in school, duck and cover. And if you think about it logically, if you're a standing target, you're quite a large, in my case, 6 feet tall, 18 inches, 24 inches wide. If you lie down, you've reduced your profile by 90%. That immediately reduces the amount of effect that blast, radiation, and everything else can have on you, because you've reduced the surface area that can absorb the effects. So duck to get flat, or as near flat as you can, and take cover, because there will be flying debris everywhere. There will be falling walls, falling buildings. So duck and cover is the thing. And in those days, it was a case of get under your desk at school. Take cover under your desk. That was ducking and covering. The second one is, as I mentioned, that radiation is the silent killer, and absolutely devastating if you get high levels of radiation poisoning. Not necessarily fatal if you can get treatment in time, or if you can avoid getting that big dose. But there's a lot of dust involved. So the first thing to do once the immediate blast is over and the immediate effects are over is improvise a dust mask. Now, we're currently going through the virus epidemic, and lots of people have surgical masks, and that's great. But even if you've got a surgical mask on, the dust can get in around the edges of it, and a surgical mask will help. But please, I ask you, as far as possible, make it better than that if you can. Wrap clothing around it, wrap a shirt around it, wrap a shirt sleeve, wrap it, anything to improve on the filtration effect of that dust mask.
Well, this brings us to a very important point before we get to number 3. Be aware of your surroundings. Anything can happen at any time, whether it's a small emergency or something big like what we're discussing today.
Yep.
You might want to look around to see where you can duck and cover. Also, if you don't have a mask or anything near you, look around, see what you're doing. Talk about why it's important and how an average person can be more aware of his or her surroundings at any time.
Absolutely. In any crisis, there's a thing that the military teach, situational awareness. It applies to every aspect of life. What happens if there's a robber comes into the restaurant where you're eating with your family? What are you going to do? In the same way, as Chris says, quite rightly, look around. Where are the exits? Where are the places in which you can duck and take cover? And if you're out in the streets, for example, even getting down beside the curb, lowers your profile, and provides some element of protection. So there's always something, there's always somewhere. You might be right next to a subway entrance. When did you last pass a subway entrance? When did you last pass a garage with a basement area? Those would be good places to think of going in the event of something or some awful event like this occurring. They're useful in many other scenarios too, so it's worth knowing where to go. The other big one is that, funnily enough, in any building, pretty much, one of the best places to take cover for almost any type of event is a bathroom. Bathrooms are particularly good places to have to hide up. And in the event of a nuclear attack, you may have to be there for a while, as I'll cover in a few minutes. A bathroom has the other big advantage of running water, a water supply, and that can be really important. So you've ducked and covered, you've improvised a dust mask, you've pulled your shirt up around your face or something. And then the next thing to do is what's called the first assessment. That is, instead of immediately running like a headless chicken back home because you think that's the right thing to do, or you haven't thought at all, it's just your instinct. Stop, take a breath, do that first assessment. How close am I to where the event happened? How big an event was it? Was it really nuclear? Was it something else? Really hard to do accurately, but if you've already thought through a set of plans, you can then think to yourself, I think this is that, so I think I should do that. And by doing that, you already have the steps for that plan that you've made beforehand and considered without the adrenaline rush. You can then start to implement the plan that you've already considered. You're much more likely to make the right choices if you do that.
Tim, let's say we're relatively close to ground zero, where we had a chance to take initial cover. What can we do to minimize our exposure to radiation as well as possible? And I'm not going to say it's easy, but there are ways.
Absolutely. And that's the next step in the whole thing, is take shelter and avoid dust contamination. That's why I talked about bathrooms, for example. They tend not to be terribly dusty places. And any huge explosion, the blast effects are going to lift the dust out of the ground. And they're going to add to it a lot of dust from the explosion itself. And that dust will include radioactive particles, which is what will seriously do you a lot of damage after the event if you've survived. Now, you're better off working in a group if you can, but don't be a hero. It really is a case of selfishness is worth considering, because the most important thing of all is to avoid, as far as possible, becoming a casualty yourself. And to that end, you need to know about the 7 and 48 hour rules. In such an event, having found somewhere to shelter, or at least to do your first assessment, you need to know that after a nuclear attack, 90% of the radiation has decayed away and 90% of the dust has settled from the explosion after 7 hours. So that is a vitally important time to know. And then the 48-hour rule is that that's the period at which 99% of the radiation has settled down and 99% of the dust has settled down. So 7 hours is what you're looking at as your preliminary period of find the nearest. If you're close to the event, which we talked about, and by close, I mean, if you are within sight or sound of all the flashbulbs of hell, plus all the lightning on the planet going off at once, you are close. If you can see the flash, you are close enough that you need to consider serious action straight away, duck and cover. Then, as I say, you need to know that your first assessment should include the idea that you need to avoid radioactive dust contamination as far as possible, especially breathing it in. That is the most important thing. An awful lot of radioactive particles are what are called alpha particles. Those can settle on your skin and not do you a huge amount of damage. But if you breathe them in, they will cause immense damage very quickly. So the 7-hour rule for 90% and the 48-hour rule for 99% of dust and radiation decreasing are really important to know. And that gives you two windows, because 7 hours, it's really easy to duck into a subway tunnel and stay there, to duck into a bathroom in a building basement and stay there, to do whatever it takes while the dust cloud rolls over, while the dust settles, while all the debris falls, comes out of the sky, while buildings fall down around you. 7 hours is not a long time in real terms. You don't need to do anything to survive 7 hours except protect your airway. 48 hours is more difficult. You need some water. Only drink water from a source you're sure is clean, which would include, in a building, the water that's already in the pipes. But you definitely do not want, or water in bottles from shops and what have you. But you certainly don't want to drink out of puddles at that stage.
No, you don't want to do that. This is Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host for this week. With me, Senior Fellow at the London Center, Lieutenant Colonel, retired British Army, Tim Wilson. We're talking about how to survive a nuclear attack. Tim, you've trained people how to do this both in the Army and civilians. We're going to continue this discussion, but if you'd like to comment or discuss this video, feel free to do that in our comment section below on the YouTube channel, Thought to Action. Plus, if you really enjoy what we're doing, feel free to join our Patreon page or share this video with your colleagues and friends and on your social networks. Tim, below ground as far as sheltering is ideal, and we're at this point, but what do we do if going underground is not possible at the moment where someone is after a blast?
The first thing to do is this assessment about how close are you to the blast, how much danger are you in? And I discussed this in detail in the pamphlet, which, by the way, you can find at londoncentre.org under my bio, which you can find on about the centre. And this entire guide is available as a PDF there for download. And basically that assessment includes things like, if you're in a car offers minimal protection. But if you set the air to recirculate, it filters air quite well. So if possible, if the car continues to run, and what have you, use the car to get out of the area. One of the biggest things is getting out of the radiation area. And in the guide, I provide some rough rules of thumb. Everything, of course, depends on the size of the bomb, the height it went off, where it went off, and what have you. So many factors you can't possibly take into account. But it's not a bad rule of thumb to say that a likely terrorist event is going to have an immediate zone 1 of radiation effect, which is about 70 miles long and about 30 miles wide. So no matter what size it actually is, if you like, if you work on the principle that you need to get out of the area, that tells you that you need to go across the wind. That is to say, not downwind from the blast, not up towards the blast, but across wind from the blast, about a minimum of 15 miles, preferably 30 miles. If you do that, and at 2 miles an hour, almost anybody can do that if they just keep walking, right? It might take you 15 hours, it might take you all day, as it were, but you can walk out of it. However, I would not recommend that for at least the 7 hours to let 90% of the radiation out. Better still, 48 hours to allow 99% of the radiation and dust to die down. But if you can't find underground shelter in your immediate vicinity, lie down flat, and if possible, find something like a blanket or whatever to cover yourself with. And then at the earliest possible opportunity, after things have settled down a bit, take a chance, look around, and you will probably find, as you start to move crosswind, somewhere where you can take a better shelter. Now, the big thing then is that you're almost certainly contaminated with radioactive dust. So if you've protected your airway, you then need to get that dust off you. And particularly, again, important to get it out of your hair. How do you do that? The very best thing you can find, and it's in winter in New York City, for example, it's a horrifying thought, but the Hudson is there. It's a running water source, and therefore it is likely to be extremely clean. So hypothermia is easier to deal with at this stage than radiation sickness. Radiation sickness is a long-lasting thing. Hypothermia, you're unlikely to suffer if you make it very quick. I would strongly suggest, if you think you've been contaminated with dust, jump in the river very quickly, very shortly, scrub your hair while you're in there, jump in fully clothed. Get out and try and find dry clothes, try and find a way. But at the worst case, if you have, because you've still got plenty of energy, you've had breakfast, you've had lunch or whatever, you will not kill yourself just by jumping in the river and climbing back out, having scrubbed your hair on the way. And you will dry out from the physical activity if you determinedly set off walking. So that is one thing to do. The other thing to do, of course, is to find shelter somewhere and a change of clothes. And basically, a lot then depends, stepping back to making that assessment on your first assessment of whether you evacuate and get out of the area, which is, once again, as with so many other things, like a terrorist attack of any sort, run, hide, or fight. Running and hiding are the two things you can do in a nuclear event. If you can evacuate out of the area, do it. If you can't, you need to find a permanent shelter for at least 48 hours, possibly even for a couple of weeks. And if it happens to be that you're at home and you've prepared, you already have a very good idea of where best to do that.
We talked about the radioactive dust with the aftermath, but what people have to remember is a nuclear blast is a chemical reaction all around.
Yep.
And the fallout also includes dangerous isotopes of iodine.
Yep.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. One of the most dangerous things that happens is that the radioactive materials include, as Chris says, radioactive isotopes of iodine. And those are absorbed very heavily, in particular by the thyroid gland in the neck. And they can be mitigated extremely by a single dose of potassium iodide, which is something available to take over the counter. It's not something you should take prophylactically. It's not something you should take without a prescription under most circumstances. But if in your emergency kit you have potassium iodide tablets and you are in the fallout area, which could be as much as 150 miles downwind from a nuclear explosion, then it would be sensible to take a single dose of potassium iodide. I have some in my cupboard. It will sit there. I won't take it unless I happen to be involved in and around the area of a nuclear explosion. But it is extremely effective at reducing radiation sickness from the absorption of the body of radioactive isotopes.
This all leads to the next question, Tim. Considering the varied atmospheric conditions we're presenting, the choice between staying put or evacuating.
Yep, absolutely. And as I say, so much depends how close you are. But as a general rule, the closer you are, the more you want to get away if you can. But you need to make that calm decision about whether you're increasing your risk by plowing through dusty radioactive areas. And it may be better if you have found a particularly good shelter to stay where you are. If you're injured, you may not be able to move. So you try and get yourself into the best shelter you can. But if you decide to evacuate, you must go crosswind. That's the important thing. That is the least distance to get out of the radioactive cloud, away from the radioactive material. And basically, if this happens, I would also point out that America is a huge country with vast resources, and you wouldn't be alone. Now, the emergency services locally would be overwhelmed or even destroyed, but it would not take very long under such a circumstance for the entire resources of the United States to wind up to help as far as they possibly could. So you could expect to see help working its way towards the center. And that's another reason to evacuate. The further out you get, the more likely you are to find help. So do you evacuate or do you go is a big decision. If you can find decent shelter, take it and stay there at least for 48 hours. possibly for longer. And that's your time when you pull out of your survival pack, your emergency radio, and you listen to what instructions are being given nationally. And if you evacuate, the other thing is take along at least your emergency supplies of a few bottles of water if you can, and some other equipment that I mention is reasonably helpful. If you've got prepared a go bag ahead of time, for example, take the go bag with you. But most people are not that fit. So a maximum of 20 pounds is the weight to consider into a backpack. The other thing to consider is whether you can use something like a child stroller, a shopping cart or whatever, and whether it will help or not. Pushing it around may help carry more, but it may also detract because it's awkward and therefore drains your strength. But the big thing there is only take the essentials. Your laptop is not an essential. Work is not going to happen in the next 48 hours if you've been involved in a nuclear attack. So forget it. Lock your value, if you happen to be at home, lock your valuables up and deal with collecting them later. Don't try and take your Rembrandt or Picasso with you. You are just going to be A, cluttering yourself down, weighing yourself down with unnecessary products, and B, the chances are a thief might recognize it on the way and you make yourself more of a target as you're trying to evacuate. So take the minimum essentials and start walking crosswind. That's the wind on your cheek, not on in your face and not on the back of your head. Wind on your cheek, one cheek or the other. It doesn't matter which one. But basically, I say to you, if you're on the coast, head inland. Just head inland.
Tim, let's talk about recovery. How long and what would it take to clean out areas from ground zero outward?
Wow. Can I work back in instead? Basically, as I mentioned earlier, the radioactive cloud could contaminate land out to several hundred miles. The lighter that contamination is, the less time it will take to sort of clean up. But it's extremely difficult. There are areas around Chernobyl. The effects of Chernobyl spread out over 1,000 miles, but the permanent effects of Chernobyl spread out over 50 miles downwind. And they've had to make enormous efforts to clean up after that. Some of those effects are pretty much permanent. The half-life of radioactive materials varies greatly depending on the material. The reason that 99% of the radiation goes after 48 hours is because most of those isotopes transmute into stable isotopes which do not emit radiation within 48 hours. But the half-life of some of them is measured in hundreds of years and a very few is in thousands of years. So if you like, the cleanup will be hugely difficult, hugely expensive, and would almost certainly result in some areas being effectively permanently out of bounds.
Tim, there are also ways to prepare at home. You alluded to this about the go bag, learning to assess your situation and where you are, maybe enhancing your talents in doing that. Although we hope never, and I repeat this, I hope we never have to use any of this.
Yep.
While some have shelters, many others do not. What can we do to prepare to cover and hunker down for a while at home or somewhere else if we can after a nuclear attack?
Have this discussion at home. Talk with people to involve them, because if they're involved in making the decision, even the kids, it matters. It means they know where to go. For example, if you've gone out to the shops when this awful event happens and you can't get home easily, give everybody in the family a chance to understand and then discuss. Are you going to get under the kitchen table? How can you improve the kitchen table to become a real shelter for up to 48 hours? And there are things you can do. You can pile stuff on top of the table so that any dust that settles on. Where is the best place? It's basements. Where is the next best place? It's ground floor. And the higher up you go, the more risk you're at for a whole variety of reasons. But That's why I come back over and over to bathrooms are particularly good as well. It provides you with a water source, and you don't need to get out from the shelter that you've made. But maybe the kitchen table, maybe, I don't know, under a counter, maybe under the stairs. And you can add to those places and make them better and better by doing things like stacking up heavy objects on top and round the sides to create your very own shelter. It's called sheltering in place, and in the event of a nuclear attack, you really do want to shelter. And the thicker the barrier between you and any radioactive dust that may be settling, the better. So not next to the walls of the house, certainly not up in the attic under the eaves of the house. If you can get basically 18 inches of dirt or 6 inches of concrete or 1 inch of steel, that is absolutely ideal. You've built yourself really a very effective nuclear shelter. But those things are usually difficult or too impossible to do. There are still nuclear shelters in Manhattan, I would say, however. Find your old nuclear bunker and head for that. They still maintain them. They still keep some supplies in them. But improvise. And that's where the family discussion comes in. Improvisation involves taking ideas from anybody and saying, how can we, what would we do? How would we do it? How would we make it better?
Once again, this video we're producing for you, How to Survive a Nuclear Attack, is a primer. Tim, you go more in depth on what to do, emergency services, and threat assessment in your publication, which once again, How to Survive a Nuclear Attack, that's the title, can be found on the London Centre for Policy Research website, londoncenter.org. Emergency preparedness and threat assessment are important survival skills, and Tim Wilson, thank you very much for publishing this important booklet and helping prepare our Thought to Action viewers and listeners become better prepared in case of a nuclear attack.
If I may, I will just say, I wrote the thing not because I wanted to, but because I realized that I couldn't find a good guide. So I thought, the more information you have, the better off you are. I wrote it in the absolutely sincere and deep hope it would never need to be used. But if you've made a plan, you improve your chances. And I thought it should be public information.
It also will help in preparing for other emergencies as well.
Yep.
Thank you for watching and listening to this special edition of Thought to Action. We cannot do this without you. If you would like to help us produce content like this, as well as enjoy sneak previews of Thought to Action and exclusive productions, please feel free to help us out through a Patreon subscription at patreon.com/thought-to-action. That's patreon.com/thought-to-action. What would also help us out is if you like this episode and enjoy our discussion, find it important, please put a like on it, comment, and share this with your friends, colleagues, and social media network. And subscribe to our channel, Thought to Action, if you haven't already. Thank you for being a part of our program.